That's the most interesting part. I do believe we are indeed live, even though I don't see a preview picture. Yes, there we are. All right. Okay. So sorry for the delay and welcome everybody to today's episode of Coffee, Kegs and Kriegsspiel, the IKS podcast, which usually should have been starting 10 minutes ago. All right, so Marshall is not available right now. He might be joining us later on. What we are going to talk about today is, well, different periods, I guess. I titled the podcast episode Wrapping Your Head Around Uncommon Periods, even though I guess most of the periods we'll be talking about are not that uncommon, but are not those that we usually play in the IKS. And I see John's in the audience as well. If you want to join me on the podium, just hop in. Same is, of course, true for Nick and Pete. So yesterday, as our Open Saturday game, I did run another 7 Years War scenario, this time based on the Battle of Kolin in 1757. So that's the European theater, of course. I will on the side open my tabletop simulator so that you can take a look at the map in a moment. And we haven't run 7 Years War battles in quite a while. There was a time period in which we did that. Felix and I especially did several scenarios in the 7 Years War, based on the 7 Years War in Europe. And of course there were several scenarios on the French and Indian Wars and stuff. Let me create this. And what was so interesting for me, and that's why I guess we want to talk about that today, is how different it is, even though it is relatively close to the Napoleonic Wars. The tactics and unit behaviors and so on differ quite a lot, even though some of the tactical concepts, you can say, which sort of were the engine to success during the Revolutionary Wars and the Napoleonic Wars, were already used. And I'm gonna switch over to TTS so that you can see the map and what I'm talking about. If I'm able to do that. There it is. I should probably share my screen for the Discord as well if I can. I can do that here. Go live. There we are. All right. Okay, so this is the area around Kolin. If you're not familiar with the battle, it's quite an interesting one. The overall context is that in 1756, Frederick, King of Prussia, invaded Saxony preemptively because it was already sort of clear that an alliance would form against Prussia. So he decided, because Prussia always had the smaller army compared to the other European powers, Russia, France, and the Habsburg Empire, that it would be best to strike first. And the previous wars he had been fighting, the Silesian Wars, for example, showed that this was quite successful, right? Strike quick and hard with a smaller army with superior tactics. And he believed the same would be true for this conflict, so he invaded Saxony without much resistance, and then commenced his offensive the year after into Bohemia, tried to capture Prague, which didn't work out. They had quite a battle at the gates of Prague, where the Prussians won a very Pyrrhic victory with about 14,000 losses on both sides. The Habsburgs retired behind the walls, and well, then Frederick started to besiege the Bohemian capital and believed, well, the Habsburgs won't send anything to threaten me because they're just incapable of organizing another army. Well, time proved him wrong. Feldmarschall Daun very quickly was able to assemble a very large army, an army larger than the Prussian army, and it still had reinforcements trickling in. So eventually, Frederick, who still didn't believe that the Habsburgs were actually going to attack him at Prague, sent only small contingencies to delay their advance if they would attack. And then he was forced to almost abandon the siege. He left units behind to keep the siege up and moved part of his army eastwards in direction of Kolin, and arrived along this main highway here. The Habsburgs had about, I think, 15 to 20,000 soldiers more than the Prussian army had. They were prepared. In the beginning, they were deployed along this. You probably can't see this because of all the drawings, but here's a chain of mill ponds along this creek running from the south to the north. And then overnight or the evening, the Prussians arrived along this main road. And that's one point we'll come back to in a second. The Prussians basically marched along this road, then turned face southwards, right? Turned face to the right, and attacked. And the Habsburgs, in time, managed to wheel their whole formation around to deploy along. Basically, I can probably better draw that on so that you can see what I'm referring to. Managed to deploy a line along these hills to the old Swedish rampart there. Okay. And Frederick didn't really know how strong the Habsburgs were. So much when it comes to recon and scouting. He didn't know, but he was very convinced that it wouldn't matter anyways because of the supposed superiority of the Prussian army. And he tried to, what he did before and later on, tried to basically outflank the larger army here, break their morale, drive them off the field. Well, it turned out that the enemy was way too strong and too organized to simply rout off the field once the Prussians arrived. So that didn't really work out for him, and he basically lost the battle. There is one very iconic painting referring to the situation after the battle, which shows an old Frederick. When the battle occurred, he wasn't that old, but that's one of the very typical or iconic paintings that we have showing Frederick. Okay, so I won't go over the details of how the battle developed or unfolded. You can go back and watch the live stream. I think Marshall streamed it and I did as well. I will upload that to YouTube very soon. Okay, let me switch back so that you can see me as I'm talking to you. Now, there were several very interesting points that could be observed. We played the game with, I think, 18 players and 4 umpires, which worked relatively well because some of the, due to the way the armies are organized during the 7 Years' War with their several wings, player commanders were often co-located, and so it was easy to give them bulk reports, so to say. Which are the points I found most interesting to see? And it was partly due to how we handled the game as umpires. So we were probably too easy in several regards on the players. We should have given them, or I should have given them, a briefing that goes more into details regarding the unit behavior and tactics. That's something see, Otto joined the audience. Otto does really well with his systems and the periods he's portraying. I've done that for my Napoleonic scenarios as well, but not so much for the 7 Years' War. So that's one thing on my to-do list. I'll write a manual for 7 Years' War for players and for umpires, of course, because it seems to be very difficult for us, both groups alike, to really sort of change our mindset and adapt to the period we are portraying, if it is one that we are not portraying regularly, right? We're usually playing Napoleonics, American Civil War, and 7 Years' War we haven't done in a while. So it needs some time or preparation, and sadly sometimes you don't have that time when it comes to Open Saturday to really get into the groove and the right mindset to approach the situation appropriately. Back to the map. So I mentioned the way the Prussian army arrived historically along this highway here, the main road, the Colline Road, which is that red one there in the north, and then basically just turned on the spot and advanced in the direction of the Habsburg positions down here on the high ground. Why did they do that? Because that's how usually 7 Years' War armies, at least on the continent, behaved. The Prussians had for about like 20 years or so, I believe, or even might be even 30 years, already introduced cadence marching. The Habsburgs had only very briefly before the 7 Years' War introduced cadence marching in their manuals, in their drill manuals. So units are much less agile than they are during the Napoleonic Wars, where battalions and brigades, and that sort of allows the agility overall, the tactical agility of the Napoleonic Wars, were able to operate independently, were able to wheel around, to adjust their formation, to quickly form square or assault columns, or switch between different formations. And that's not so much true for the 7 Years' War. Yes, sometimes there are some occasions when infantry formed square. And yes, especially the Prussian army is very keen on what's called the Après doctrine. That is basically the same doctrine that sort of culminates in the French assault columns, right? Very aggressively advancing towards the enemy, firing some salvos, advancing, firing, advancing, and then charging the enemy with the bayonet, and basically just break their morale rather than destroy their forces or kill the soldiers. And that is what makes the success of Frederick. But nonetheless, even that is very difficult to enact in the field, based on the terrain, based on the fact that the various battalions, once they are deployed into line, can't really deal with terrain and so on, and they get disordered rather quickly. So the only way to really successfully implement this offensive doctrine is by rigid drills. And as you know, the Prussian army lost quite a number of veterans during the 7 Years' War. So there's a reason why Frederick wasn't always successful with that. So that's one thing, right? You need to be much harsher on the players. Same with this movement down here we had yesterday in the battle, where basically the units reacted easily to threats from the flanks, which should not have been possible. That's the one big reason why the armies of the 7 Years' War on the European continent come with huge cavalry forces. You can see the historic order of battle here. That would have been all the forces involved in the actual battle. Prussian army here on the bottom, and then up there the Habsburg forces. And you can see, compared to the unit types, infantry is a very little part of both armies. It's maybe 1/3, potentially even. Well, the battalions have, of course, more soldiers than the squadrons have, but from coverage and so on, you could say maybe it's even a quarter of the army when it comes to the Prussians here. And they have huge cavalry wings, cuirassiers, dragoons, and hussars. It's a bit interesting here that the Prussian army has quite a lot of hussars actually in the reserve, because usually the Habsburg armies were much stronger on light troops, that is hussars and so-called Grenzer regiments or battalions, which come from the border regions of the Habsburg Empire and are, because of the mountainous terrain and the forest and so on, used to fighting in rough ground, you could say. So that's a specialty of the Habsburg army, while probably the Prussian army is quite strong. They had elite hussar regiments, yes, but they're probably much stronger when it comes to grenadiers and so on, and heavy cavalry. Okay, so why do you need so much cavalry? It's not so much that, as in the Napoleonic Wars, they are roaming wild in the countryside and trying to screen their armies and get a recon advantage against the enemy. Of course that happens, but not to the same degree as it does during the Napoleonic Wars. You need the cavalry to protect the infantry, because the infantry can simply not react to threats showing up in their flanks. And I mean, even during the Napoleonic Wars, we have these situations where whole brigades rout from one second to the other when a single enemy battalion shows up in their flank and they didn't see it coming, right? So imagine you have a line infantry center of your army, and then out of a sudden, and they are not to the same degree able to react to whatever might come up on their flank. And then imagine something comes there and what's going to happen to your army, right? So you need the cavalry to first of all, protect your own flanks. What's interesting, the Prussians, I think they have like a double protection system. They have these two brigades here, which consist of concentrated grenadier battalions. So these are the flank guard brigades. To protect the flanks of the infantry center, they put their best infantry units, and in addition to that, they put the heavy cavalry. So first of all, you need to protect the infantry. Then you want to break the enemy cavalry, right? To gain the advantage and to win the battle, you need to rout the enemy infantry, basically. And how do you do that? Well, you win the cavalry fight on the flank, and then just make them rout away or overrun them. And you can also see the huge amount of reserves they have, especially when it comes to cavalry again, because cavalry and the flanks are so important. The infantry will be rather static, even though, as we have talked about earlier, especially the Prussians are keen on aggressively attacking. But still they need reserves to plug the gaps, because even Prussian grenadiers will rout eventually and break away. Okay, so there are basically two big points, right? Infantry has to march up in marching column, and then can only really deploy orderly by turning around on the spot. They cannot move single battalions around through the creeks and over the hills and then deploy as they want to do. And that's one thing we didn't really enforce, so to say, during the battle. Then the cavalry needs to be on the flanks. Well, due to the terrain, the Prussian right flank here in this scenario, how it played out, was basically protected by the creek and the mill ponds, so it was rather easy to block these towns against the enemy cavalry coming in and threatening them. And then we had a relatively huge cavalry battle on their left flank, the Habsburg right flank, in the north, where there is this open, relatively open plain with some smooth hills. Okay, so we have infantry, we have cavalry. What else do we have? We have the artillery. Artillery during this time they are heavy guns, right? So the batteries, and you can sort of trace that up until the mid of the Napoleonic Wars. The Habsburg then are still struggling with this concept. They have heavy guns, while the French then with the beginning, or just simply prior to the Revolutionary Wars, swapped their artillery system to introduce lighter guns, standardized guns, because they realized that the caliber of the guns doesn't really matter when it comes to field battles. Of course, they still had 12-pounders and so on, because their range is a little bit further than the smaller guns, 6-pounders and 8-pounders. But they found out, and it's a little bit interesting because of the infantry here is already using regimental guns, of course, so 3-pounders, 4-pounders, small guns for close range support. But the 6-pounders apparently proved to be much more efficient during the Napoleonic Wars. But yeah, if you want to really put down artillery fire and disrupt the enemy, prepare your attack, which you need to do because your infantry attack will be that fragile during the 7 Years' War, right? Will potentially come in disordered, and you need to decrease the enemy morale before the infantry hits. So that makes the placement and the handling of the artillery much more difficult, because they are heavy guns. So that means once they are deployed in a given spot, it will be very hard to get them moving again to support the attack. They cannot, as the Napoleonic guns do, move, then follow the infantry, deploy or unlimber again and again and again, and support them fire, then advance, and so on. So that's another reason why we see relatively linear lines and static deployments in the 7 Years' War in Europe. And that's all those points. I'm not quite sure. Maybe there are more, and I'd like to invite again John and Pete and so on, and Bevilia, who were there yesterday, to share their observations and the points they thought were interesting in that regard, and what follows from these observations is probably the questions: how do we adapt? So that's the umpires, and also how do we make the players change their mindset and think differently, approach the strategic and tactical problems differently, and that is appropriately to the historical context, right? And John just joined me, so
good morning, Jan.
Good morning. Hello.
Hey, as I was listening to you describe that, it's fascinating to me, because I did have I was commanding the cavalry for the Prussians, and I did have a Napoleonic concept in my mind, and that I operated my cavalry really as a Napoleonic cavalry, not as a 7 Years cavalry, because I'm not familiar with the time period. I'm not familiar with the details of the differences between them tactically, and so I did operate very much on a Napoleonic side. It's interesting because as you were describing, I was thinking, yes, I should have operated it differently, because we split our cavalry force. We had essentially a light cavalry force, which was 4 squadrons of hussars and 4 squadrons of dragoons, and then we had a heavy section, which was 4 cuirassiers and 4 dragoons. And we sent the cuirassier and and their associated dragoons with the main army going south. And I took the light cavalry, which was the hussars and 4 squadrons of dragoons, down that main road. And yeah, if you were operating it correctly, I should have had all the cavalry together up there, because what I ran into, of course, was the bulk of their army, plus what did they have? 2 heavy cavalry groups up there as well. And obviously I was completely outmatched, but I was thinking in terms of my function in this battle was supposed to be to keep the enemy army entertained and delay them while the main attack was going down in the south. And so I was performing with that in mind and simply falling back and delaying, but I could not match their cavalry. If their cavalry had been more aggressive early on, they would have swept me right off the field, because there was no way I could match all those cuirassiers. And every time I did send in my dragoons to run into them, the dragoons got totally badly handled. They got wrecked every time I did do that. But of course, I was essentially sacrificing them. I was trying to just wear out the enemy cavalry and slow everything down. But again, yeah, if I understood the differences, and if that were enforced by the umpires, the way the infantry could work, that ground down to the south where the main army was going was essentially useless for that heavy cavalry. They weren't going to be have much of an impact down there. And so they would have been much better placed with me so that I could actually match his heavy cavalry on the wing. So yeah, it's fascinating listening to you talk about it, because it is a significant difference, and it is something that I'm not familiar with. So yeah.
Yeah, and after we finished the game and this discussion yesterday, I thought about, because we also discussed briefly what could be done to enforce or create awareness, probably. And I was wondering if it would have been beneficial if we had actually simply enforced unit behavior, which would probably have meant that the game would basically have ended with your initial cavalry charge when you overrun the head of the Habsburg column, right? When they redeployed in the morning, because then basically their center would have been gone, and that most likely would not have been a very pleasant experience for the players, right? Okay. Thank you for planning. Thank you for planning half an hour. Now we are done.
Yes, you've been defeated. And that was interesting too, because it's an interesting moment. I watched the live stream last night before I went to bed, and I watched Marshall's live stream. And so you can see what he was talking about. And there's a moment there where, first of all, I'm not really sure what hallucinogen he was on, but the idea that, I mean, he had his infantry that morning, is what you're talking about. He had his infantry in column on that road, and without knowing what was in front of him, except that he knew that there were some cavalry vedettes out there, he put his infantry on the road in column and started to march down that road. What he didn't realize was that I had my 4 squadrons of dragoons plus 4 squadrons of hussars that were like right in front of him.
Yep.
And he started marching right into them. And of course I ordered my dragoons to charge. And at that point he's telling his brigadier, "Oh, this is good. They won't charge. They'll fall back, and even if they do charge, it'll be worse for them." And I'm thinking, in what universe is cavalry charging a column of infantry on a road bad for the cavalry? That's just not the reality. And of course, those dragoons did wreck the front of that column, and they were spent in the process. So I pulled them back, but that was the only damage that was done to them. But yeah, thinking of that, I mean, yes, if they should have swept that area with all that heavy cavalry to his right first, or at least pushed out so that they had me pushed back so that they could move the infantry. But they didn't. They just came right to me, and it was an interesting moment though. But you could see in his mind too, because he had asked earlier about going into square, and I asked you also at one point, can the infantry go into square, because I wasn't familiar with the time period, and I was told, as you told me, the Austrians almost certainly not, the Prussians maybe, you know. So I'm thinking, okay, well, they're in a column on the road. They're not going to be able to go into square. They're going to get ate up. They're going to get tore up pretty good. But yeah, it's an interesting thing. You're right. If this had been enforced in that way, really strictly, then that charge would have probably sent that entire column reeling. His entire force would have broken down, because they would have seen cavalry running down the front of it, and they would have just turned.
Right.
So it would have changed the entire game.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it would have been hard for you guys to enforce that, because recognizing that we didn't know those differences. So that kind of information and understanding that time period would have made that, then you could have enforced it. But since we didn't really understand it at all, we were kind of, going blind in that regard.
Right.
But yeah, I love the period. It's fascinating to me because I don't know it very well. I'm learning it, and like yesterday's experience was a great learning experience for me.
Yeah, for me as well, as I said. So we haven't been running 7 Years War for quite a while, so there's certainly some work to be done. And I would like, Otto, if you want to join us, as you are the king of player handbooks, I would like to hear your thoughts on whether you think that a substantial handbook or a primer on 7 Years War tactics or unit behavior would have made a difference for an Open Saturday game, right? Because often in Open Saturday you have players joining right before the game, and they are not really involved in prior planning processes and so on. So it's quite different than a game we would have set up that would have been an actual like teaching game. And this is how, like, okay, if this charge routed the Habsburg army, okay, then we just start over, we learn from it, we start over, and sort of repeat the learning process. But Open Saturday is quite different. So what is your opinion on that?
You can hear me, right?
Yes.
Okay. Well, yeah. So I really like the handbook idea, even though it's a ton of work, to be honest. As the more in-depth and realistic the game and the system is, the longer your handbook is going to be. So there's a lot of stuff for the empires to write and for the players to read. I think it's a good question, that thing that players often don't have really time, nor possibly interest to read a document about the period and everything. But I think it is something that can be changed. And the thing is that the players don't necessarily have to read this document in question. It can become the responsibility of the commander-in-chief, since they want their team to win. They can read this document and basically explain to the subordinates in this planning phase of the game in some bullet point style speech about what they want their troops to do, what they want their subordinates to do, and what are some key things about this period they should keep in mind. This happened, for example, in a World War II game where Marshall and Tunis were leading the Soviet forces, and Marshall had written a very Soviet-style speech for the beginning of the offensive. He read on stream for his subordinates, but it also included a lot about the Soviet doctrine and their idea. It wasn't that in depth, of course, as the document. I hadn't even made a document or anything at that point, but I think it's something that can become the job of the commander-in-chief. And also, I think for Open Saturday games, I think it should be perhaps made possible in future games that you can kind of take already slot some people onto each side, so they are more up to speed, so they have had time to prepare.
Yeah, certainly so.
Yeah, I think what Otto said about the bullet points, especially for an Open Saturday, some kind of bullet point key differences or key things to keep in mind. You know, even if it's just like 4 or 5 things that they can easily look through and keep in mind, would be really beneficial for something like that.
Yeah, that's for someone else to make, because I have lost the ability to write short documents. It's not something I can do anymore. Yeah, but also I think there could be, when I'm making these long documents in mind, it takes a lot of work to write them, but I think there's a lot of good information for them, and I think there's already in Kriegsspiel there's some responsibility for the players. So when I'm making a really long document, I think, well, I'm putting so much effort into this game, perhaps the players could put in a bit of that effort as well by reading this 50-word page document. Well, but you get the idea. I think as games become more realistic, the players have to get themselves more involved as well.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, cool.
Yeah, at least on the higher command level, that's for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Let me see if we have any questions in the chat. That does not seem to be the case. Anybody else in the audience who wants to speak about yesterday's game or the question of how to get players to behave like period commanders? Please raise your hand and we will pull you on the stage.
Beverly wrote in the chat
there.
He wants to come.
Okay, how do I do this actually? There, invite to speak. Hello.
Hello.
Good morning.
Oh, good afternoon to you folks. Yeah, so I was just writing in the chat there that as part of my IRL career, I'm part of a public sector organisation that regularly encounters people who use our service, who come to us not even knowing what they don't know. So they have no idea where to start, and there's a lot of stuff that they do need to know, which I think has a lot of similarities to people dropping in on Open Saturday games with no idea what the complex situation is, militarily speaking. And as part of that, we've actually been putting together these 1-minute guides, which are kind of single page. Here's your very, very summarized key information that lets you know the very basics and lets you get started on looking up more information now that you have an idea of what you don't know. And I'm wondering if something like that, which is like, one of those, maybe for each time period, maybe one for each of the major factions in each time period, depending on how detailed we wanted to get and how much distinction there was between factions in any given time period, could be useful as okay, welcome to Open Saturday. Here's your 1-minute guide on the troops you're going to be commanding. if you've got any more questions, ask your commander, who would presumably be more experienced with the area of command that they volunteer to command on an Open Saturday game.
Right, yeah, that's a very good idea. So Otto, maybe if you're not willing to write 50-page handbooks anymore, that's the next thing for you.
Yeah, the thing with that I really like the handbooks is that it can be revisited. So I'm not that giving speeches is cool, but I think I'll let the commander-in-chiefs do that, because I think I've gotten to move myself to the written format because it can be revisited also like during the game. But yeah, it would obviously be a good idea to have some sort of short bullet point listing. But I think that can be made by the commander-in-chief. So I'm just saying, do that for me, please. I don't want to do that work.
Well,
yeah. Also, well, Bavila, you were talking. That something came to me in mind. These handbooks things, they're super long. So this doesn't really fix that problem. But I realized that it doesn't necessarily. None of these handbooks need to be given to the players in the planning phase of the game, unlike the briefing necessarily. Like you could, with the announcement of the Open Saturday game, you could put in the links for the player guides in the announcement as well. You could even have both of the nation-specific briefings, guides linked there. And you could say, if you have read the other one, you're just a veteran of warfare and you're familiar with the enemy tactics as you would usually be. You don't know the enemy plan and everything anyways from a handbook, but just not the intricacies.
Vivier, you wanted to add something?
I just wanted to say here, this would very much be something to complement those larger guides rather than necessarily replace them, because but you wouldn't necessarily want these to be something that the commanders would put together on the day or ahead of the day, because the ideal situation would be that the umpires and the players would both have access to the same guide, and therefore both would be going into the game with the same kind of expectations for what their units were capable of. Whereas if the commander of one side puts together a briefing for their own side, that may not necessarily mesh with what the umpire who, well, to use myself as an example here, I'd never run a 7 years war game before partaking yesterday. So there were several points where I myself had to double check what the capabilities of the units I was umpiring were. So making sure that everyone was operating from the same hymn sheet, so to speak.
Right. Okay. Very good. Check one more time on the YouTube chat. There are no questions. All right. John, do you have any closing remarks before we end the stream?
No, sir. I think this was very useful. And yesterday's game, I enjoyed a great deal because there were so many decision points. I had tremendous challenges, and it was a great learning experience about the period and how to operate in that period, and I really enjoy that. So.
Yeah, I love that. I love that too. Right, and it's so to say that it's always a learning experience for everybody involved. That is the players and the umpires too. So, all right. Well, then, thanks a lot for all the input and the ideas. We certainly have some more tasks on our to-do list regarding the 7 Years' War. And thank you, everybody who was listening or will be listening in the future on YouTube.